is a violent action that wields its force in several rapid components. Within seconds, the explosion has spread mass destruction over a large area surrounding Ground Zero. But long after the effects of the explosion have subsided, one component remains: radioactive fallout.
The particles may be as fine as dust, or sand, or tiny flakes of ash. They may appear hours after a nuclear explosion, dropping from a sky in which no radioactive cloud is visible, dropping gently and silently like snow. Fallout can be dangerous, but it is not mysterious. The danger can be measured and described, and it can be guarded against. Our purpose is to examine some of the effects of nuclear weapons, with primary emphasis on radioactive fallout. Let's define the problem. First of all, about 90% of the energy is expended in the first minute immediately following the burst. This energy appears as thermal radiation, light and heat, as a blast wave, and as initial nuclear radiation. This energy is expended rapidly and in a relatively limited area surrounding the point of explosion. For example, the damaging effects from a 10 megaton weapon will be limited to a distance of about 30 miles from Ground Zero. The remaining 10% is what the technical people call residual nuclear radiation, a term that applies to all nuclear radiation occurring after the first minute. The primary source of this radiation is radioactive fallout. When we say that fallout particles are radioactive, we mean that they emit nuclear radiation, primarily beta and gamma. Where does radioactive fallout come from? In a surface burst, large quantities of dirt and other debris are drawn into the cloud at early times. These particles mix with the vaporized radioactive products produced in the explosion. The radioactive materials then condense on the dirt and debris particles, making them highly radioactive. Meanwhile, the whole cloud is gaining altitude at a rapid rate, carrying the radioactive dirt particles with it. After the cloud reaches its maximum height, at about 10 minutes, it spreads out laterally and is dispersed by the high-altitude winds. It may continue to be visible for an hour or more before merging with the surrounding atmosphere. As the violent disturbances due to the explosion subside, the radioactive particles gradually fall back to Earth. This is fallout. The early fallout, that is, fallout from particles of visible size, continues for the better part of a day, dispersing over an area that extends several hundred miles downwind. Most of the very small particles remain suspended in the atmosphere, where wind transports them thousands of miles around the world before finally descending to Earth. These small particles contribute to the delayed or worldwide fallout. However, in terms of survival after a nuclear attack, it is the early fallout that presents the serious hazard. Why are these particles so dangerous? Because, in plain language, nuclear radiation will kill you if you get too much of it. How much is too much? First, we need a unit for measuring such radiation exposure. This unit is the Röntgen, named for the man who discovered X-rays. Röntgens are used to measure exposure to the penetrating gamma rays, which are very much like high-energy X-rays. When measuring radiation, there are two things we want to know. The first is the dose rate, or rate of exposure, which is expressed in Röntgens per hour. The other is the total dose, or total exposure, which is the product of the dose rate and time expressed in Röntgens. For example, if you are exposed to 10 Röntgens per hour for 5 hours, you'll receive a total dose of 50 Röntgens. Of course, we're not considering the decrease in the 10 Röntgen per hour dose rate with time in this example. We'll come to the question of radioactive decay of fallout in a minute. But now to our question of how much is too much. Exposure of the whole body to less than 200 Röntgens within 1 to 2 days will not seriously incapacitate you. If this exposure were received over a longer period of time, it would be even less serious. If the exposure is increased to about 450 Roentgens in a 1 or 2 day period, then all those so exposed will probably be quite sick, and approximately half of them will die. 600 or 700 Roentgen exposure, whole body exposure, 1 or 2 days, would kill just about everyone exposed. Remember, as these same exposures are spread over longer periods of time, the effects of the exposure become less serious. Now, with this in mind, look at the fallout pattern created by the fallout from a test shot at Bikini some years ago. This was a 15 megaton surface burst. Each contour line shows the total dose in Roentgens accumulated in 96 hours after the explosion. Notice that the 96-hour accumulated dose 300 miles from ground zero was about 100 Roentgens. That the 1,000 Roentgen dose level went out 160 miles, and the 3,000 Roentgen contour more than 100 miles. Now, any kind of shelter would have reduced the dose received, and there was time to find shelter. The fallout began here about 7 hours after the explosion, and it took another 5 to 6 hours to reach this point. 3 things should be emphasized here. First, there is no fixed pattern to fallout. For a surface burst like this one, the time that fallout begins and the dose rate at any given location will vary with the wind conditions and other factors. In passing, it should be noted that a high air burst produces a negligible amount of fallout. Secondly, we should also emphasize the persistence of radioactivity. Fallout may continue to be significantly radioactive for many months, but the dose rate decreases with time after burst. There's a convenient 7-10 rule of thumb that can be applied during the first few weeks to approximate radioactive decay. For every 7-fold increase in time, there is a 10-fold decrease in dose rate. For example, suppose the dose rate 12 hours after the explosion is 80 Roentgens per hour. Then at the end of 84 hours, which is 7 times 12, it'll be 1/10 of that, or 8 Roentgens per hour. And finally, it should be emphasized that fallout consists of particulate matter, particles that have size and dimension. These particles are subject to a large measure of control. We can take shelter from them, shield ourselves from their radiations, cover them up, or wash them away.
Radioactive fallout can harbor silent danger long after the visible effects of a nuclear explosion have ceased. It can spread to areas many miles from ground zero. But in the final analysis, even after fallout has arrived, it can be subjected to a large measure of control.